So if everybody could take their seats, I think we're ready to get going. So good morning once again. I'm Len Friedman, and it is a true honor to have such a distinguished group here today at Asilomar. I have a couple of housekeeping notes that I need to tell you now because otherwise I will forget. Number one, these cards that you received in your registration bags have instructions on the bottom on how to sign into Wi-Fi in this room. I guess there's a separate, unique set of instructions for your guest rooms, but you can just follow those. We are going to try, if people are still speaking to each other tomorrow, just a joke. Got to keep things light here. We're going to try to have a group photo at 10:30 tomorrow morning, as I said, assuming that you all want to be with each other tomorrow morning. If you have not registered, there are a few people here who actually haven't registered, not for the room, but for the meeting, so that you can, get your program and your nice bag. You can do so in the back of the room. Kirsten Poole is back there and has the materials for you. There'll be coffee set up at 9:30. There's a formal coffee break at 11. Yeah, 11? 10:30. You can see I'm really with the program here. The bathrooms are, you walk out the back exit there, take a left and take another left, and you will reach the bathrooms. A word about Asilomar. It's a beautiful, beautiful location. We chose this very intentionally. It has a very historic, despite a little piece in Nature a year ago, talking about sort of the trademark of Asilomar. There's some very important meetings that have taken place here in this conference. They're very important biology meetings, including the original recombinant DNA biosafety meetings, when people thought that recombinant DNA plasmids poured down the sink were going to create five-headed monsters. So we chose this site. You're kind of a captive audience here, which is the way we want it, but it's also a beautiful site. So I hope you enjoy the rustic accommodations and the Pacific Ocean, if there's any time to escape to the beach. The weather, thank you. I arranged some really amazing weather here. It's not always like this. I've been here before. To have sunny skies in the mid-80s Fahrenheit is pretty extraordinary for this time of year. So, we thought of everything. At least I thought we did. Before we actually roll up our sleeves and really get to work, and we have a lot of work to do in the next 2 days, I need to thank some people formally for their tremendous help and support for this meeting. First, I'd like to thank GBSI's own Leadership Circle members for their ongoing support of GBSI's mission. These sponsors provide the essential core support for GBSI, and we hope to see this list grow in the future. People have also wondered if we would actually be able to successfully bring together the producers and the users in the antibody community. And you can look around. The response from certainly the producer community has really been tremendous, and we thank you for it. Many corporate sponsors have stepped up to the plate and supported this meeting, and we want to acknowledge you today. Whoops, that's not good. So these are the bronze sponsor supporters, and this is all in your program. A number of companies, silver sponsor supporters, and we really want to give a very special thanks, gold sponsor supporters, and we want to give a very special thanks to our two platinum sponsors, NIH and Thermo Fisher, for their truly extraordinary support for this meeting. So thank you to all the sponsors. We could not have done this. GBSI is a nonprofit. This is not a for-profit in any way, shape, or form kind of experience for us. So thanks to all of you. I also want to thank the Antibody Society for their support as well. The origins, actually, of the Asilomar meeting took place at a breakfast meeting at Logan Airport with myself, Jim Houston, and Jan Reichart of the Antibody Society. It was actually Jim's idea to have this meeting at Asilomar, so you can thank or blame Jim after the meeting. And it was also motivated by an excellent piece that came out around that time by two members of our steering committee, Andrew Bradbury and Andreas Plukton, on really calling for a need for standards for research antibodies. And it was a very visible paper. I'd also like to, and so thanks to Andreas and Andrew and the Antibody Society for their early support and continuing support for this meeting. I'd also like to give a shout out to our workshop steering committee. They're shown here. Andrew, Josh LeBaire, Andreas, Jan Reichart, David Rim, and Matthias Uhlen. The steering committee provided constant invaluable guidance on every aspect of planning and programming, and were available probably for more meetings and phone calls than they care to think about at this point. I'd also like to introduce a number of people that have been really critical for the backstory support for this meeting. Carol Miller, our communications advisor. Whoops, no slide for Carol. Nancy Kelly, a strategic advisor at GBSI. They both play very important roles at GBSI. And also two people who you will be getting to know quite well in the course of this meeting, and that is Kavita Berger and Emily Billings. They're our facilitators from Griffin Scientific. They've had a very major role in the design of the workshop, and a tremendous amount of work, I should point out, on the development of the consensus building papers, which was really a lot of effort and a lot of thought went into it, and I hope you've all read it. Really goes out to Emily, who's in the back there, she was really instrumental in putting those papers together. So thanks to all. And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to personally thank GBSI's tireless, committed staff. They have attention for every detail. A meeting like this really, crafting an antibody validation meeting is as hard as crafting validation standards, I can tell you. And I think that, this included the pre-workshop dialogues that hopefully you've all taken part in, the survey we ran, which many of you participated in, not to mention the logistics to bring you all here and house you here during this meeting. So I'd really like to give a special thanks to Michael Byrne, Kirsten Poole, and Roseanne Weissman, all of whom are here today. So thank you to all of you. Okay, that's the acknowledgments. So why are we here? GBSI, my organization, has really been focusing on the role of standards and best practices that really can address the overall reproducibility crisis, the so-called reproducibility crisis in biomedical research. There's no doubt in my mind, and I don't think in anybody in attendance is here mind, sorry, that, see, I get choked up when I think about reproducibility. It's a major, antibodies are clearly a major contributor to the issues around reproducibility. There are complex contributors to reproducibility, but in terms of the bioreagent piece, antibodies are a huge component of this problem. And they're also quite clearly, as we'll see over the next 48 hours, among the most complex to resolve. And we're going to try to do that here. There have been, I acknowledge the fact that there have been several meetings over the last decade that have tried to create guidelines and implement guidelines around antibodies. There have even been a few, I think, important meetings this past year, even this past month in Bath, for example, in the UK. Andy Chalmers is here, who led that effort. I think that all of those meetings have really helped focus on the issue, but I think we really need to have a very, very clear pathway towards a solution set, and I'm not letting anybody leave here until we do. So there you go. We've worked very hard for this particular workshop to make sure that we had all the key stakeholders who are part of the solution. Academia, producers, service providers, journals, funders. You're all here, and I'm really gratified by that. I think GBSI, together with all of you, are completely committed to developing tangible, workable, affordable recommendations for adoption that will satisfy all the stakeholders who really have a part of this solution, the problem and solution. So I want to just take a few minutes. I have a half an hour. I want to take a few minutes and really put the problem around antibodies, because we're going to really focus in after this talk exclusively on antibodies, and really give you the sort of broad context of the general reproducibility issue. And this is a slide that I put together a couple of years ago that shows, I think, 5 of the major publications that really put a spotlight on the irreproducibility issue. Of course, the big one, the one I think, in my opinion, was a tipping point was the Begley and Ellis paper in Nature, and Glenn Begley will be here later this afternoon and will be here for the remainder of the meeting, where 53 very highly cited, high-impact cancer biology papers, only 11% of those papers that were attempted to be reproduced by Begley and Ellis were in fact reproducible, at least based on their definitions of reproducibility. And that really, I think, although this problem has been around for many, many years, we've all experienced it in one form or another, I think this paper, probably more than any other, really sort of, as I said, was a tipping point for the community. Another paper that I'd like to sort of put in perspective, because it really sort of focuses on the huge amount of dollars that are impacted on irreproducible research, is a paper that I published with 2 economists from Boston University, Ian Cockburn and Tim Simcoe. This came out in PLOS Biology a year and a half ago, and it really focused on sort of a top-down and bottom-up calculation of the dollars that are spent, essentially, on irreproducible research. And just bear with me for a couple of slides. This really just shows you the total spend, at least in 2014, in the United States alone, on essentially biomedical research, both clinical. This is a funky pointer. Okay, both clinical and preclinical. It's actually about equivalent, $56 billion in preclinical research, $58 billion in clinical research, and this is essentially a sum of industry, NIH, other funder spends on biomedical research. We were focused on preclinical research because the focus of irreproducibility was in the preclinical space. And in one of the 2 analyses we did in this paper, which was a really simple top-down analysis, we took this $56 billion number, and we conservatively, and I think if you take Glenn Begley's work and others, I think 50% is the irreproducibility rate we applied, which I would argue is conservative compared to what other people have published. And you come up with the number $28 billion. It's half of 56. And so essentially, of that $56 billion spend, $28 billion is, in 2014 was being applied to research that wasn't necessarily reproducible. We also did a more complex, sort of economics-based bottom-up analysis where we identified 4 of the major drivers in the process of research in one's lab: reagents, study design, data analysis, lab protocols. And we, based on some fairly big assumptions and some meta-analyses, we tried to put percentages and numbers to the $28 billion spend. And we actually, the pointer's not working, we came up with about $10 billion, which is applied to biological reagents and reference materials. I show you this because I would say a good part of that $10 billion is probably antibodies. Can't really put a number on that, but even if it's 5, even if it's 3, it's a huge number. So I think that really puts some perspective on, what we're doing here and why we're here. Okay. So really from production variations to transparency in reagent information and resellers to how a user should appropriately validate an antibody, the fact that each antibody application has its own unique issues as it relates to validation, to how recombinant antibodies will eventually become the norm despite issues and concerns over intellectual property, an area we'll discuss at length at this meeting. They're all challenges for us. But it also provides an opportunity for us, the research community, and by that I mean, again, all the stakeholders involved, the producers, the resellers, the researchers, the funders, the journals. We need to come together to create valuable and important new tools to further the research progress so we can lower that irreproducibility gap and really bring back money that is really poorly being spent because on irreproducible research. And ultimately, let's not lose perspective. That will accelerate new discoveries, new cures, new treatments, and data that's actually replicable and reproducible. So we're all part of the problem here. We all are part of the problem, but we're all part of the solution. And I think that that's something we need to sort of remind ourselves as discussions get passionate today and tomorrow. So in the end, really, antibodies really need to do 3 fundamental things. I mean, this is a no-brainer for this audience. They need to bind their target. Generally speaking, an antibody that binds better with better affinity are going to be a better reagent than those that bind more weakly. They must not bind to anything else, so specificity is incredibly important. The few cross-reactions, if any, the fewer cross-reactions, the better, the best, no cross-reactions. And they obviously must be detectable by any number of readouts, whether it's fluorescence or whatever. So the easier to measure, the better they are. So we need those standards and guidelines to achieve this. And so here's my charge to you all. The charge is this: we need to devise a strategy or a set of strategies to achieve very tangible, usable validation guidelines for research antibodies and a path to implementing those strategies so that these standards that we are talking about really become, I hate to use this phrase, the new normal. This has to become sort of second nature to everyone. So simply put, the outcomes we want to achieve in this meeting are consensus standards for antibody validation, consensus recommendations for adoption and implementation, and these will both absolutely involve the producers and the users. It cannot take place without both working in tandem. Otherwise, we will absolutely fail. So I know that I'm not so naive that that by tomorrow afternoon, when we're finishing, that these outcomes are all tied up in neat little bows, and we will pat ourselves on the back. But we will have more work to do, and we will by tomorrow afternoon have a clear plan to complete those tasks. Nobody will be leaving here until we devise a very clear timeline, even perhaps assigning tasks to those of you that volunteer or I volunteer you for. So we will have a very, people have asked me in the lead up to this meeting and at this and last night, what's the end game here? The end game is validation standards. But in 2 days, we may not magically have those standards in detail, but we will have a plan, and we will follow up in a very systematic way to that plan. The other point I want to make is that this is a participatory workshop. That's how we designed it. It was very intentional. The sessions are designed to maximize the participation for everybody, not just the panelists and the moderator, but absolutely all of you. The workshop builds, I should point out, on what we think was the successful series of online dialogues that we put together and that many of you participated in. And I should say that we had over 400 comments in our discussions on Protocol IO. And that is a prompt for a slide. Protocols IO. And I want to personally thank Lenny Tettleman for Protocols IO is his baby, and he very graciously allowed us to use this platform to have Protocols IO, to have the GBSI antibody validation online group be hosted on Protocols IO. And this was also a tremendous amount of work to set up. And it wasn't clear whether you people and others actually from the antibody community would participate, but it really picked up steam. And in particular, I saw in the last month, it really picked up quite a bit of steam, and I thought the discussions were extremely interesting and provocative, and we used quite a bit of that information in those 4 consensus papers that you all have in your packets, and hopefully you have read. The other point I want to make in terms of the agenda, and I'm going to go through the agenda briefly in a minute, is that we also are going, and I've never done this, I've never participated in anything like this before, so I'm as naive to this as you, but we are going to poll you. Not on the Trump-Clinton debate, although we're going to try to watch that too, but we'll see how that works out during dinner. Andrew's in charge of that. It was his idea. But we're going to poll you several times throughout these 2 days of discussion. And really to take your temperature, we want to build to consensus. We weren't just really talking out of the sides of our mouth when we said, this is a consensus building meeting. We actually want to come, if possible, to consensus here. And the only way you can do that is by voting. And so you have a thingy here. I don't know what these thingies are called. They're not barcodes. And there's also a link, and that was included in the 5 emails, and that was just a glitch from whatever server the 5 emails were sent from. And, but there's a link in those 5 emails to this app called Group Map, and that's what we're going to be using from each of your individual cell phones to vote in the course. In fact, we have one coming up this morning. So be ready. Again, I've never done anything like this before, but I think it's kind of exciting. We'll see how it works. Okay, now to the agenda. So we've organized, this is a 2-day workshop. We gave a lot of thought to how to organize the topics here. And really, the bottom line is that the first day is really focused exclusively on the approaches to antibody standards, the science, the approaches, the standards themselves. This morning, the breakout sessions this afternoon, and all the discussion that goes along with it. The second day is really primarily centered on how to implement those guidelines. So first day of the guidelines, second day is the implementation. This morning is devoted to the science, as I mentioned, including, and I think it's important to mention this, including the conceptual framework that came out of the International Working Group on Antibody Validation, headed up by Matthias Uhlen. They put that forward in a Nature Methods paper that was published 3 weeks ago or a month ago. And we'll have a bit more time to discuss that in a minute. I also mentioned that Andrew and Andreas published a very important piece last year in Nature, in particular on the role of recombinant antibodies and how recombinant antibodies can really contribute to validation and reproducibility. And obviously they've been champions for an expanded use of recombinant antibodies. And so we have a whole session devoted to recombinants later this morning. Or yes, later this morning. Is it tomorrow? It's after lunch today. It's not tomorrow. In the afternoon is when we're going to really roll up our sleeves and hopefully not roll up our sleeves and start punching. But we're going to break out into what are now 7 breakout groups. And they are defined by more or less the 7 most common antibody applications. You've all signed up, hopefully, to each of those breakout groups based on your own scientific interests. And really the way I look at the sort of fit-for-purpose application-specific approaches here, which are defined by the breakout sessions. There was a lot of discussion in the online dialogues about sort of, the conceptual pillars, again, that were, I think, eloquently articulated in the Nature Methods paper versus the sort of quote-unquote fit-for-purpose application specificity. The way I personally look at this, and I've struggled with this as we've developed this meeting, is that we're going to take the conceptual pillars of the International Working Group and try to go much deeper into the individual applications for validating antibodies. And so since each of those require their own relatively unique set of applications, or maybe perhaps, if we're lucky, some overlapping set of guidelines, we have each of these breakout groups, which will follow a fairly unified, uniform set of criteria, and you will have that you have that in your packets. We can come up with some level of detail around each of these applications. That's the intent, that's the rationale for the breakout groups. Okay, so as I said, you've been assigned, we've assigned group chairs. They know who they are. You've selected your group. We will report back, we'll discuss, we will argue, we will mud wrestle, and then ultimately we'll vote on potential consensus strategies as they relate to each of these applications. Tonight after dinner, and hopefully the debate, we'll reconvene for one session on the role of antibody databases and how they contribute to the solution set for validation. And then, I don't know how late the bar's open, but you're welcome to the bar as late as it's open. On the second day, after a recap of the first, we'll focus on the challenges of implementation and compliance, as I mentioned. And this is as complex as and it must really, again, equally engage the producers and the users. I fortunately or unfortunately was quoted in one of the science journals as calling it the two-headed monster, and really the point was that there are issues, and some of them are unique and some of them are common to the producers. Obviously, the issues of QC, QA to ensure their antibodies work, and then the researchers. Among some of these issues, and I'll show you in a minute, are poor training methods, and the idea of perhaps even proficiency testing for the researchers. In the first session, tomorrow we'll focus on the role of the producers, and as I said, the producers are very well represented at this meeting. About just under half of the people here are from producer companies or reseller companies, and so transparency as it relates to validation, possibility of a certification system, as David McAdams was discussing last night, perhaps a rating system, the role of resellers, how ultimately this is all passed down to the users, the academic community and others, in an economically feasible way is all on the table for discussion. The next set of sessions focus on the community, the users, and how these standards can drive to adoption. So we'll focus on what I call the levers, which are the funders and the journals, and we'll hear the perspective of a major funder, or maybe the major funder of biomedical research, and that's NIH. Jim Anderson is here, Deputy Director, reports to Francis Collins, and he'll give you his perspective on both the rigor and reproducibility initiatives at NIH, and more specifically how that relates to antibodies as well. And we also were really very fortunate to have a panel that we will convene of very esteemed editors from 5 of the leading biomedical journals. So I'm looking forward to that. And then finally, we'll discuss the important role of training and how to increase proficiency of the end users. And this is particularly of interest to GBSI, A year ago, we carried out a survey. We actually did this in parallel to a survey we did on cell authentication. We actually got over 500 respondents for this survey, and having never done one before, that's a pretty darn impressive number. These are just some of the data. Almost everybody conducted basic research. The majority were in academia. What was really interesting, and this was published in Biotechniques earlier this year, 2016, and what really stood out, and the reason why I'm mentioning this, is one really interesting and I would say disturbing response, which is when we analyzed this based on years of experience by the respondent. Over a third of the sort of quote-unquote young researchers, less than 5 years of experience past a PhD, responded that, well, I don't really have my antibodies validated. And moreover, they actually did not see the necessity of validating their antibodies. So one of the bottom line conclusions we took from this survey in this Biotechniques paper is that we need to really look at how we're training our students, postdocs, maybe even junior PIs in this space. So we'll have a really, I think, interesting discussion on that. So we'll wrap up the workshop, if you're still all here, late Tuesday afternoon. I know you will be here. And that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to solidify the consensus we've achieved. We're going to talk about how to implement. We're going to solidify the implementation strategies around that. And we will, as a group, re-review the key conclusions and, importantly, as I said, map a timeline for specific next steps and specific strategies on how to really disseminate our conclusions to the broader research community. And then we'll all go home, exhausted, but very proud of what we've accomplished. All right, so I did that in a half an hour. Thank you.